The year was 1886, and the high plains of the Colorado Territory were already tasting of the coming winter on the late autumn wind. For Elara Vance, the wind carried not just the promise of snow, but the sharp, metallic scent of urgency. Inside the cavernous, shadowed space of her barn, the air was still and thick with the dust of hay and the ghosts of seasons past. Armed with a heavy iron pry bar, she was committing an act that the small, scattered community of settlers already referred to in hushed tones as Elara's folly. She drove the flat, wicked end of the bar into the seam between two thick floorboards, putting the whole of her lean, wiry weight into the effort. The wood groaned, a long, deep complaint against the violation, and with a final, splintering shriek, the nails surrendered their hold. She worked with a focused, rhythmic intensity, her breath pluming in the cold air, her movements economical and devoid of any wasted motion. This was not an act of frantic destruction, but one of careful, deliberate disassembly. She was not tearing her barn apart. She was opening a door where none had existed. Her neighbors had, of course, already taken notice. It was impossible not to in a place where the next nearest roof was a mile distant, and the goings-on of any single homestead were the common currency of conversation. Amos Kelleher, a man whose opinions were as solid and unyielding as the granite outcrops that broke through the prairie soil, had been the first to stop his wagon. He had watched her for a long moment from the track, his face a mask of profound disbelief, before finally calling out, "Elara? What in God's name are you doing to your husband's barn?" His voice carried the weight of communal authority, the unspoken question not just about her actions, but about her soundness of mind. She had paused, straightened her back, which ached with a low, constant fire, and looked at him. She offered a simple, unadorned truth that she knew would satisfy no one. "I'm building a cellar, Amos." He had shaken his head, the gesture slow and laden with a pity that felt heavier than scorn. "There's a root cellar by the house, a good one. Thomas built it." He was not wrong, but the cellar Thomas had built was like all the others, a shallow pit, stone-lined, barely 8 feet deep. It fought the summer heat with limited success and offered only a prayer against the deepest fangs of a hard winter. Amos Kelleher had eventually climbed down from his wagon, his boots crunching on the dry ground as he approached the wide-open barn doors, his wife Dora remaining behind, a silent, bundled figure of disapproval. He peered into the gloom at the growing hole in the floor, at the neat stack of salvaged timbers Elara had already set aside. A cellar under the barn? The damp will rot the foundation sills. And for what? The ground freezes 6 feet down in a bad winter. You're digging for trouble and nothing more. He spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who had only ever known one way of doing things and had found it sufficient. He saw a widow, alone with 2 small children, engaging in a task that was not only arduous but, in his estimation, utterly pointless. He saw wasted effort that could be better spent mending fences or putting up the last of the preserves. He did not, and could not, see the principle that guided her. He saw only the strange, inexplicable action, and like all the others, he judged it as a symptom of grief's deranging influence. Elara had tried to explain, though she knew the futility of it even as the words formed. She spoke of the earth itself, not as a dead thing to be dug into, but as a vast, slow-breathing creature. "The ground only freezes so deep, Amos," she had said, her voice quiet but steady. "Below that, the temperature is constant. It never freezes in winter, and it stays cool all through the summer." She was reciting a lesson learned not from a farmer's almanac, but from her late husband Thomas. He had been a surveyor for the railroad, a man who carried not just chains and transits, but books filled with diagrams of rock strata and theories about the planet's internal heat. He had viewed the world in layers, understanding the forces that worked invisibly beneath the surface. Amos had simply stared at her, his expression shifting from pity to a kind of baffled irritation. "That's book talk, Ilara. It has no place out here. We live on the surface of the world, not in it. You're chasing a fancy, and you'll catch your death of cold for it." He had turned then and walked back to his wagon, the matter settled in his own mind. His verdict would ripple through the settlement, carried by his wife Dora, and Ilara's folly would be cemented as a local legend before the first true snows fell. She did not begrudge them their skepticism. It was a form of protection, a way of navigating a world fraught with peril by clinging to the known and the proven. Watching an outcome was not the same as understanding the principle. They had all seen cellars freeze, therefore, all cellars were vulnerable to freezing. Their logic was simple, direct, and born of brutal experience. Her logic, Thomas's logic, was different. It was born of observation, of looking at the prairie dogs who dug their towns far below the frost line, of watching the bears seek out deep dens, of understanding that the planet itself offered a sanctuary from its own surface extremes. Thomas had once scraped frost from a window pane and held it on his fingertip until it melted. "The air is a fickle tyrant," he had told her, his voice full of a quiet wonder she missed like a physical ache. "But the earth, Ilara, the earth has a deep and steady heart. You just have to be willing to go deep enough to feel it." That memory was the foundation of her project, a bedrock of conviction far more solid than the prairie soil she was now determined to excavate. With the floorboards removed, revealing a dark 10 by 10 foot square of packed earth, the real labor began. The first few feet were the driest, a mix of topsoil and clay that gave way grudgingly to her spade. She worked until her shoulders screamed and her hands were raw, even through worn leather gloves. Her son, 8-year-old Samuel, would watch from the barn door, his face a mixture of awe and concern for his mother's sanity. Her daughter, 6-year-old Lily, would bring her water in a tin cup, her small hand steady. They were her purpose and her audience, the silent witnesses to her gamble. Each shovelful of earth was hauled up in a bucket on a simple rope and pulley system she had rigged to a main beam overhead. She piled the dirt outside, a growing mound that became a stark, physical testament to her progress, a monument to her supposed madness that every passerby could see and comment upon. The mound grew taller than she was, then taller still, a small mountain of dark earth against the pale, dying grass of the plains. As she dug deeper, the nature of the earth changed. The dry clay gave way to a cooler, damper soil that held its shape and smelled of stone and deep water. This was the earth that had not felt the summer sun in 1,000 years. At 10 feet, the air at the bottom of the pit was noticeably cooler than the air in the barn above. At 15, it was a profound and stable cold, a palpable presence. She was not merely digging a hole, she was descending into a different climate. She remembered Thomas explaining the principle of thermal mass, how the immense bulk of the earth acted as a heat sink, absorbing the sun's energy in summer and radiating a tiny, residual warmth in winter, creating a zone of near-perfect equilibrium. He had drawn it for her in a notebook, a simple line showing the wild zigzag of surface temperatures and the gentle, almost flat wave of the subterranean climate. She was digging her way from the zigzag to the flat line. The skepticism of her neighbors was a constant low hum in the background of her days. Dora Kelleher made a special trip, ostensibly to bring a small loaf of bread, but truly to satisfy her own curiosity and gather details for the next round of gossip. She stood at the edge of the pit, peering down at Ilara's solitary, dirt-streaked figure. "Ilara, dear," she had said, her voice dripping with a cloying sympathy. "Amos is worried you'll have a cave-in, that the walls will just fall in on you." It was a genuine fear, perhaps, but it was also a weapon, a way of highlighting the perceived recklessness of the endeavor. Ilara, resting on her shovel far below, had simply looked up at the perfectly vertical, stable walls of dense, damp clay. "The earth is holding, Dora," she had replied, and that was all. She did not explain that the moisture content at this depth, combined with the clay's composition, made it as stable as soft rock. It was another principle they would not understand. They saw a hole in the ground. She saw a feat of natural engineering. Only one person watched without judgment. Constance Hartwell, a widow herself for 5 years, lived on the next claim over. She was a quiet woman who had weathered her own storms and had little time for the community's chorus of opinion. Several times, Ilara had looked up from her labor to see Constance standing by her fence line, not staring but simply observing, her arms crossed against the wind. There was a quiet curiosity in her gaze, a withholding of verdict that Ilara found more comforting than any hollow word of support. Constance understood what it meant to be alone and to have to find your own solutions. She did not offer help, nor did she offer advice. She offered only the gift of her silent, non-committal observation, and for that, Ilara was deeply grateful. It made her feel less like a spectacle and more like a woman at work. When the pit reached a depth of 20 feet, she stopped digging downward and began to hollow out a chamber, carving it directly from the hard-packed earth. The air was now so profoundly still and cool that it felt ancient. She worked by the light of a single lantern, its glow creating a small, warm bubble in the immense, silent dark. Here, she would store her vegetables, her barrels of apples, her crocks of salted butter and lard. The chamber would be a pantry, a larder, a fortress against the killing frosts and the wilting heat. Above this main chamber, closer to the surface but still deep, she carved a smaller one. This was for the meat. A slow, cool smoke was what was needed, a smoke that cured without cooking, that infused the flesh with flavor and preservative qualities over weeks, not hours. A hot smokehouse cooked the meat too quickly, rendering out the fat and leaving it dry and tough by spring. Thomas had called it the tyranny of the flame. Her smoke would be different. It would be a patient, persistent ghost, not a ravenous beast. The construction of the apparatus itself was a work of careful planning. From the floor of the smoking chamber, she dug a narrow flue that angled down and away, running nearly 30 feet horizontally before turning sharply upward to the surface, where it emerged disguised by a small pile of rocks a good distance from the barn. At the base of this flue, directly beneath the smoking chamber, she built a small stone-lined firebox, barely big enough for a few split logs. The design was based on a diagram in one of Thomas's books about Roman hypocausts. The long, angled flue would cool the smoke, allowing only the coldest, densest particulate to travel up into the chamber. The fire itself would be tiny, a smoldering, starved thing fed with green hickory and applewood. She would be able to tend it from the surface through the vertical shaft, never needing to bring the heat and flame near the meat itself. It was a system designed to separate the effect from the source, another principle that would have sounded like madness to Amos Kelleher. Lining the main shaft with stone was the most physically demanding part of the entire project. She hauled the stones herself from a creek bed half a mile away, using a small wooden cart that groaned under the weight. She chose flat, stable stones, fitting them together like a puzzle, using a mortar of clay and sand to fill the gaps. This wasn't for structural integrity, the clay walls were more than strong enough, but for permanence, and to prevent the slow, steady erosion of the walls from foot traffic. Then came the stairs. Using the timbers she had salvaged from the barn floor, she built a steep but sturdy staircase that descended into the earth, each tread securely anchored to the stone-lined walls. The final act of construction was the door at the top. A heavy, double-thick trap-door, insulated with packed wool, that fitted snugly into the opening in the barn floor, flush with the surrounding planks. When it was closed, no one would ever know the earth had been opened. By the time the first snows came, dusting the plains in a fine white powder, the work was done. The great mound of earth outside the barn was the only remaining evidence of her long weeks of toil. She had slaughtered one of her 2 hogs, butchered it with an expert's efficiency, and hung the hams, bacon, and shoulders on iron hooks in the upper chamber of her cellar. In the lower, larger chamber, bins were filled with potatoes, carrots, and turnips. Barrels of apples stood in a neat row, and shelves held her canned goods, protected from the risk of freezing and bursting that they faced in the shallow house cellar. She laid her fire in the small stone box at the bottom of the flue, using the green hickory she had cut months before. She lit it and watched until it was burning with a slow, almost imperceptible smolder, producing a steady, thin stream of fragrant, cool smoke. Then she climbed the stairs, closed the heavy trapdoor, and left the principal to do its work. The waiting was a unique form of torment, a test not of her body, but of her faith in an idea. Weeks passed. The snow deepened. The wind howled around the corners of the small cabin, a constant, mournful song. The community settled into the quiet rhythms of winter. Ilara tended her children, her remaining livestock, and her home. Every few days she would go to the barn, lift the heavy door, and descend into the earth. The air that greeted her was always the same, cool, still, and smelling faintly of hickory and clean soil. It was never cold enough to see her breath. She would check the meat, touching a ham to feel its texture as it slowly firmed, its color deepening to a rich mahogany. She would inspect the vegetables, finding them as crisp and fresh as the day they were harvested. But the true test had not yet come. This was a gentle winter so far, one that even a conventional cellar might survive. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the wind, that the real crucible was still ahead. It arrived in the second week of January. A blizzard, born in the far north, swept down across the plains with a fury that seemed biblical. It was a storm that would be spoken of for generations. The temperature plummeted to 30 below zero, and then 40. The wind, a solid, screaming wall of ice and snow, drove drifts higher than the cabin roof. For 3 days, the world vanished into a churning vortex of white. No one could leave their homes. Livestock in less sturdy barns froze to death where they stood. It was a storm that scoured the landscape and tested the very limits of survival. Inside her small cabin, huddled by the stove with her children, Ilara was not thinking of the storm outside. She was thinking of the quiet, constant temperature in the earth beneath her barn. She was placing her trust in the planet's steady heart while the sky raged with a terrible and fickle fury. When the storm finally broke, the world was remade. A pristine, silent landscape of sculpted snow lay under a sky of impossible blue, the air so cold it felt brittle, sharp enough to crack. The smoke from her own chimney rose in a perfectly straight, white line. Other, similar lines of smoke rose from the Kelleher place and the Hartwell claim, signals of survival. But she knew the cold would have been a merciless intruder. It would have crept into every crack and cranny, leaching the warmth from cabins, and, most critically, from the shallow, vulnerable cellars that held the winter's food supply. She bundled herself in every layer she possessed and made her way to the barn, carving a path through the thigh-high snow. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of her own boots. Inside the barn, the air was a pocket of biting cold, but she knew it was nothing compared to the deathly stillness outside. She heaved open the insulated trapdoor. A puff of air rose to meet her, and she felt it on her face. It was cool, but it was the cool of a cave, not the razor-sharp cold of the frozen world above. It was living air. She descended the stone-lined stairs, her lantern casting a warm, dancing glow on the walls. In the lower chamber, everything was as it should be. She took a potato from the top of a bin and sliced into it with her pocket knife. The flesh was firm, pale, and beaded with moisture. It was perfect. A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees washed over her. It was one thing to believe in a principle, to stake your labor and your family's survival on it. It was another thing entirely to hold the proof, cold and solid, in your hand. She climbed to the upper chamber where the meat was hanging. The scent of hickory was stronger here, a clean, appetizing aroma that spoke of patience and time. The hams were dark, firm, and draped in a delicate, dry pellicle. She ran her bare hand over the largest one. It was cool to the touch, but it was supple. There was no ice, no frozen stiffness that would indicate the meat's cells had been ruptured by frost, ruining its texture and flavor forever. This was not frozen meat. It was perfectly preserved meat, cured by a process that had been entirely shielded from the violent extremes of the world just 20 feet above. In that moment, standing in the quiet subterranean dark, she felt the presence of her husband so strongly, it was as if he were standing beside her. She could almost hear his voice, filled with that gentle academic excitement. The earth's steady heart, Elara. She had done more than just dig a hole. She had tapped into a fundamental law of the natural world, a secret of stability hidden just beneath the surface of a violent and unpredictable land. Her folly had become her salvation. It was 2 days later that a figure appeared, struggling through the deep snowdrifts. It was Amos Kelleher. He did not approach with his usual confident stride. His shoulders were slumped, and he moved with the slow, weary gait of a defeated man. He stopped a few yards from her cabin door, his face chapped raw by the wind, his eyes holding a desperation she had never seen there before. He did not waste time on pleasantries. "Elara," he began, his voice raspy. "The cold. It got into our cellar. It got in deep." He paused, swallowing hard against a pride that was clearly costing him a great deal. "The potatoes are frozen solid. The carrots, too. All of it. Ruined. Turned to mush." He looked away then, toward his own homestead, as if the shame of his failure was a physical thing he could not bear to face directly. Elara simply nodded. She had expected this. She felt no triumph, no smug satisfaction in being right. His failure was not her victory. They were all neighbors, bound together by the shared struggle of survival on this harsh land. His misfortune was a danger to them all, a weakening of their small, fragile community. Without a word, she went to the barn, leaving him standing in the snow. He watched her disappear inside, his expression one of confusion. A few minutes later, she re-emerged, carrying a heavy burlap sack over her shoulder and a large cloth-wrapped parcel in her arms. She walked to him and handed him the parcel first. It was a 10-pound slab of bacon. Then she lowered the sack of potatoes to the snow at his feet. "This should be enough to see you through for a while," she said. Her voice was plain, without any hint of charity or condescension. Amos stared at the provisions, then up at her. He unwrapped a corner of the cloth, revealing the rich, dark red of the cured bacon. He could smell the faint, clean scent of hickory. His own bacon, hanging in his smokehouse, was frozen as hard as a rock. He then looked at the sack. "Your cellar, it didn't freeze?" It was not a question so much as a statement of awe. She shook her head. "No, Amos, it did not." He reached down, his glove clumsy, and fumbled a single potato from the sack. He looked at it as if it were a strange artifact from another world. It was firm, heavy, and dusted with the dark, cool earth of its subterranean home. He looked from the potato to her face, and in his eyes she saw the walls of his certainty finally crumble. He saw not a madwoman, not a fool, but a provider, a survivor who had looked at the same world he did and had seen something he had missed. "How?" he asked. The single word was a surrender. It was an admission of ignorance, a request for knowledge. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. So, she told him again. She spoke of the deep earth, of the frost line, of thermal mass and stable temperatures. She used the simple words she had used before, but this time they were not just book talk. They were anchored to the proof he now held in his hands. This time he listened. He nodded slowly, his gaze distant, reevaluating years of his own experience in the light of this new, undeniable evidence. He took the food, thanked her with a humility that transformed his entire bearing, and began the long walk home, his mind clearly burdened and enlightened in equal measure. Word of the Vance cellar spread, but this time the tone was different. Pity was replaced by wonder, and ridicule by respect. The story was no longer about Alara's folly, but about the miracle of her winter provisions. A week later, Amos returned, not for more food, but with 2 other men from neighboring claims. They came with hats in hand and questions on their lips. They asked her to show them. She took them to the barn, opened the heavy trapdoor, and led them down the stairs into her hidden world. They marveled at the stone-lined walls, the ingenious ventilation, and the sheer, stable coolness of the air. They touched the hanging hams, knocked their knuckles against the barrels of apples, and spoke in low, reverent tones. They had come to see a cellar. They had discovered a principle. That spring, a new kind of work began in the settlement. The sounds of digging and the clatter of rock echoed from the Kelleher homestead, and then from others. Alara found herself an unlikely teacher, advising on depth, on ventilation, on the proper way to line a shaft with stone. She shared her knowledge freely, holding nothing back. She gave them Thomas's diagrams, explaining the simple physics of convection and heat exchange. She watched as men who had once pitied her now listened with the focused attention of students. They were practical men, and once they understood the practical benefit, they embraced the idea with the same fervor with which they had once dismissed it. They were not converting to a new faith. They were simply adopting a better tool, one that had been proven effective against their common enemy, the killing cold of winter. The legacy of her work was written in the earth of the territory. The deep, barn-floor cellar, which came to be known simply as a Vance cellar, became a standard feature of new homesteads, a mark of a well-prepared and knowledgeable settler. The great mound of dirt beside her barn was eventually spread over her garden, enriching the soil for decades of harvests. Her children, Samuel and Lily, grew up with the quiet security of a full larder, never knowing the gnawing fear of a winter shortage that had haunted so many of their neighbors. The cellar itself outlasted Alara, serving her children and her grandchildren, a silent, subterranean monument to her quiet determination. It became a piece of local history, a story told to newcomers about the widow who listened to the earth's steady heart and in doing so, taught a whole community a new and better way to survive. Her vindication was not loud or triumphant. It was quiet, deep, and as enduring as the stone walls she had laid with her own 2 hands.